All right. Chapter 2, Apostolic Age 8030 to 8080, continued. John the Baptist, Jesus Christ, Paul, Peter, John, the Jameses, the Judases, the other apostles, epistles of the New Testament, the Apocalypse. All right. The first character in Christian history is John the Baptist. What was his connection with Jesus, and what were his relations to the origin of the Christian religion? Josephus, while he gives an account of John the Baptist baptizing and making converts, says nothing of his announcing the approach of a coming Messiah. The author of Luke commences his account of John the Baptist by saying that he appeared in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, and Herod being tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip, tetrarch of Iturea and the region of Trachonitis, Lysianus, tetrarch of Abilene, Annas of Caiaphas being the high priests. In the 23rd verse of the same chapter, after relating the baptism of Jesus, he states that he began to be about 30 years of age. If by this language the author of Luke meant to say that Jesus was not then past 30, did he not make a mistake of at least 3 years? Tiberius commenced reigning AD 14, and the 15th year of his reign would be AD 29, or when Jesus was 33 years of age, as he was 4 years old at the commencement of the Christian era. We do not, however, look upon this as a very serious discrepancy and think Dr. Lardner overestimated the question when he spoke of it as one of very great difficulty. The word Hosea, about, used to be the gospel historian, relieves him from any very exact criticism. So of another objection, the statement that Annas and Caiaphas were high priests, it being notorious that the Jews never had but one high priest at a time. This has been partially explained by showing that Josephus in one place spoke of one as a high priest who had held but did not at the time referred to hold that office. The language here is somewhat more definite and appears more plainly to intimate that two did actually hold the position the same year. This would indicate that this portion of the book was written long afterwards by one not acquainted with Jewish customs. Dr. Lardner says it would be extremely unreasonable to impute to St. Luke so great a mistake as the supposing there were properly two high priests among the Jews at the same time. The most effectual way of relieving him from the imputation is not to charge upon him the authorship of a work which bears so many marks of having been written long after his day. If the passage in Josephus concerning Christ were genuine, then the failure to connect him with John the Baptist would be utterly incomprehensible. But since it is the general verdict of scholars that the paragraph in the 3rd chapter of the 18th book of Antiquities, wherein it is stated that Jesus was the Christ, etc., is an interpolated forgery, the matter appears very differently. It is easy to see that Josephus, retaining all his Jewish prejudices and antipathies, might have intentionally passed over the proclamation of the coming Messiah. Perusing the biography of John as given in the gospel history, the next incident presents a difficulty of a more serious character. It is stated that Herod the Tetrarch shut up John in prison, being reproved by him for Herodotus, his brother Philip's wife. This Philip could be no other than Philip the Tetrarch of Trachonitis, mentioned in Luke 3:1. He was the brother, or rather half-brother, of Herod the Tetrarch, and Herod had no other brother Philip. They were both sons of Herod the Great. But according to Josephus, Philip could not have been the former husband of Herodotus. It was another Herod, half-brother of Herod the Tetrarch, having the same father but not the same mother. The father of this Herod was Herod the Great, while his mother was Miriam, daughter of Simon the high priest. Josephus could not well be mistaken in this matter, being himself a Jew and all the parties occupying a high position among his people. Not only were all these sons of Herod the Great, but Herodotus was sister of Agrippa the Great. The attention of the historian was particularly called to the transaction, and he relates in full the visit of Herod the Tetrarch to Herod, his half-brother, his falling in love with Herodotus, his brother's wife, and their subsequent arrangement to be married. Also, the difference that arose on this very account between Herod the Tetrarch and Aretas, king of Peretria, father of the wife of whom Herod put aside in favor of Herodotus, a difficulty which resulted in a war. The gospel account of the death of John is also very different from that of the historian. It does not appear in Luke, but in Mark and Matthew it is related that the daughter of Herodotus danced before Herod at a supper given by him on his birthday. Mark 6:21-22, that Herod was pleased and promised to give her whatever she could ask, and she, being instructed by her mother, asked the head of John the Baptist, that the king ordered it to be given her, and it was brought in a charger. The account of Josephus is, in substance, that John was a good man, that he commanded the Jews to exercise virtue and exhorted them to come to his baptism, that the crowds came about him much pleased at his discourses, that Herod feared that his great influence over the people might put it into his power and inclination to raise a rebellion, that the people being ready to do anything he should advise, that to prevent any mischief he might do, and to put it out of his power to raise a rebellion, Herod had him thrown into a prison at Machaerus, and there put to death. Though it might be possible by the exercise of skill and ingenuity to show that the accounts of John the Baptist as given by Josephus on the one hand and the gospel historians on the other are not absolutely contradictory, except as to the former husband of Herodotus. Yet the general tenor of the two biographies is so different and the narrative so divergent as to render it problematical whether John sustained any such relation to Jesus as is commonly supposed. The Gospel of Marcion, AD 145, which in other respects was very similar to Luke, contained no such history of John. Marcion's Gospel was probably first written. The first two chapters of Luke were not in Marcion. In place of the third and fourth chapters, there was the first chapter in Marcion's Gospel, which commenced as follows. Now in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate, ruling in Judea, Jesus came down to Capernaum, a city of Galilee, and straightway on the Sabbath days, going into the synagogue, he taught. 2. And they were astonished at his doctrine, for his word was with power. There was no statement in Marcion as to the age of Christ, nor concerning the two high priests, nor were there any contradictions of Josephus. Before leaving the history of John the Baptist, we cannot refrain from referring to the grotesque incident of the daughter of Herodotus dancing at a supper given by Herod to his lords, high captains, and chief estates. This portion of the narrative caused a sore trial to the faith of the great Dr. Lardner. It may perhaps be expected, he says, I should here produce an instance about that time of some lady of like station with Herodotus' daughter, who danced at a public entertainment. But I must own I am not furnished with any instance exactly parallel. Although the doctor did not hesitate to believe in miracles, yet when anything purported to be inside the bounds of nature, he desired to see it within the range of probability. Jesus Christ. The next character is Christ himself. He is said to have been begotten of a virgin by the overshadowing of the Holy Ghost. This event does not appear to have been mentioned in heathen Jewish or Christian history until more than 100 years after it is said to have taken place. The doctrine of the Immaculate or Miraculous Conception, when it was promulgated to the Christians of the 2nd century, was found to be so congenial to the prevailing disposition to defy Christ that it was at once taken up by the bishops and incorporated among the foundations of the grand religious structure then being erected. Paul, who had already laid the foundations of the structure, seems to have known nothing of the doctrine. It was somewhat incongruous to defy a person born in the ordinary course of generation. The miraculous conception was needed to give form and consistency to the doctrine of the divinity of Jesus. Many attempts have been made to write the life of Christ, but it is difficult to see where, outside the Gospels, the material for such a work is to come from, while, if the Gospels are to be taken as a basis, it is equally difficult to understand what is to be gained by rewriting what is contained in them. Any such attempt only brings out in plainer light the discrepancies in those accounts and finally results in a mere display of ingenuity on the part of the biographer in his efforts to reconcile them, or, as in the case of some writers, in a sublime unconsciousness of any discrepancies whatever. We know of Christ historically that he was a prominent moral and religious teacher, that he had the most devoted followers and disciples, that he was put to death in the reign of Tiberius Caesar, and that upon his doctrines and precepts and upon a belief in his spiritual resurrection, Paul, the chief of his disciples, founded a new religion. That Paul was the one who did the work is manifest from recorded tradition and from those wonderful epistles written in the first century, which are still extant, and the most of which are considered by scholars to be genuine. Countless volumes have been written concerning Paul, works abounding in unmixed eulogy. It is the duty of the impartial historian, while appreciating and admiring those grand qualities which mark him as one of the greatest men of any age, while conceding his intellectual and moral grandeur, his thorough conviction of the truth of the doctrines he was teaching, and the zeal and devotion which he manifested in their propagation, to point out at the same time some of the defects in his character. The chief of these, which was the result of his excessive zeal, was an impatience and even a vindictiveness towards those who differed with him in opinion. By an occasional outburst of the spirit of persecution under the influence of which he had so unrelentingly pursued the Christians, he demonstrates that however thorough he was his conversion, it had not eradicated or essentially changed those traits of character and peculiarities of disposition which distinguished him from other men. Commentators would have us believe that when, in his epistle to the Galatians, he said, "I would they were even cut off who trouble you," he meant nothing more than that they should be cut off from the church. But this he had power to have done, and did direct it in addressing other churches. An examination of the context and of the whole epistle, in the commencement of which he had anathematized anyone who should preach any other doctrine. Let him be accursed altogether, with the application of a careful and thorough philosophical analysis of the words used by the apostle, and all combined to give to his language a deeper meaning, showing that in a moment of exasperation he gave utterance to the sentiment which, taken in connection with the teaching and practice of Peter, and the construction which was put upon some of the sayings of Christ, resulted in the most fearful and widespread persecutions through subsequent ages. It is not strange that the apostle should have such feelings towards those whom he saw endeavoring to remove some of the beautiful pillars from the splendid edifice he was constructing. But it is to be regretted that he did not foresee the use which could be made of his language in after times. Again, notwithstanding the spirit of kindness, of brotherly love, and even of tenderness pervading the letters of the apostle, there may be discovered occasionally beneath it all glimpses of an overbearing and tyrannical disposition. This is particularly noticeable in his injunctions to the female Christians and in his determination to discontinuance any ambition on their part to take an equal place with their brothers in the management of church affairs. They were permitted to hold the position of deaconess, an office that functions of which consisted principally of ministering to the necessities of the saints, an office of labor and subserviency they could fill, but not one of honor. I suffer not a woman to teach, said Paul, thus disclosing his domineering spirit and his inability to rise above the prejudices of the age. This prohibition of the apostle was scrupulously carried out, and in the Council of Laodicea, A.D. 365, the 11th canon forbade the ordination of women for the ministry, while the 44th canon prohibited them from entering into the altar. By the point upon which the fathers were most sensitive, in reference to the position of women in the church related to administering the rite of baptism. One of the earliest Christian writings was the Acts of Paul and Thessala. It was a romance. Thessala, who was engaged to be married, had heard from an upper window, Paul preaching. She had fallen in love with him, had deserted her lover and relatives, and had followed Paul, had become a devoted Christian, had baptized, the first baptizing herself. Then she worked miracles, became a saint, and finally a martyr. She was held in the highest veneration by the fathers. But the book gave an implied sanction to the right of a woman to baptize. On that account, it was declared heretical, and search was made for its author, an unusual proceeding in those days. It was traced to the presbyter of one of the Eastern churches, who acknowledged he had written it for the honor of Paul. He was tried for the offense, and being convicted, was disposed from the ministry. The woman claimed the right to baptize their own sex, but the bishops and presbyters did not care to be relieved from the pleasant duty of baptizing the female converts. Of the life of Paul we know but little. The accounts in the Acts of the Apostles cannot, for reasons which will hereafter be given, be considered historical. In the first epistle of Clement of Rome, it is stated that Paul was 7 times imprisoned. Dr. Dullinger says Paul was 7 times in prison. Was Paul married, as Subius said? Paul does not demur in a certain epistle to mention his own wife, whom he did not take about with him in order to expedite his ministry the better. In saying this, Eusebius was quoting from the Stromata of Clement of Alexandria, A.D. 200. The full message in Clement is as follows. Paul does not indeed in certain epistle fear to speak of his own wife, whom he did not take account with him, because it was not necessary for him in the great work of the ministry. Therefore he says in a certain epistle, have we not power to take about a sister wife, as also the other apostles? For they, as was proper while engaged in the ministry, because they could not keep them apart, were accustomed doubtless as a matter of commendation to take about with the female attendants, not as wives, but as sisters, who, together with the female servants, might be among the women who had charge of the house, by whom, without any reprehension or suspicion of evil, the doctrine of the Lord might be carried even to the secret apartments of the women. Paul, according to the fathers, was martyred at Rome AD 67 or 68. An interesting story is preserved of Paul and Perpetua. It is related that Perpetua, seeing Paul dragged along the streets of Rome in irons, had compassion upon him and wept bitterly. She had but one eye. Paul asked her for her handkerchief. She gave it. It was tied around Paul's head and afterward returned to her bloody. When she received it back, her other eye was restored. Perpetua was afterward thrown into prison and tortured, and at last, with a great stone tied to her neck, was thrown over a precipice. There was between Paul and his followers on one side and Peter, there was between Paul and his followers on one side and Peter and his followers on the other, a strong antagonism not generally understood in our day, and which, if properly taken into account, will explain several knotty points of Scripture and throw light upon many controverted questions in the early history of the church. Paul was rejected by large bodies of Jewish Christians, and in the entire volume of the Recognitions, a Petrine work of the early ages, abounding in Scripture quotations, there is not a single citation from Paul's epistles. The controversy related principally in the first instance to the observance by the Christians of Jewish rites and ceremonies, but afterwards it became hereditary and traditional. The Ebionites claimed that Paul was an impostor, that he only became a convert for the purpose of obtaining a Jewish lady with whom he had fallen in love, and when he failed, he turned against the Jews and opposed their observances and customs. Well, wait a second. His epistles. Nah, I'll stop.